There are two big questions for Finlay. One is, can just war theory extend to cyber warfare? Can you just take the just war theory framework and say, okay, cyber warfare is the same? Or is cyber warfare so different that it requires a totally new framework? And another question in the neighborhood is, are cyber attacks, when there's a cyber attack, is it fundamentally different from physical attacks? Or is it the same sort of thing? So that's one question in the background of Finlay's piece. Another is, are cyber attacks acts of espionage, like spying, or acts of war? Is it more like a spy sneaking into a building and stealing something, or is it more like launching missiles at the other country? And Finlay notes that how we answer this is going to give us different approaches, and it's going to license different approaches for how we respond to cyber attacks. So if it's like espionage, then criminal charges are going to be more appropriate. And if it's like an act of war, if it's like another country coming in and bombing us, then it's more like retaliatory war. And a counterstrike is appropriate, and a physical strike might be appropriate. So here are some claims that Finlay makes in his paper. One is that the revisionist framework, rather than the just war framework, is useful to approach how we should think about cyber attacks, whether it's war versus espionage. And so here's how he's understanding the revisionist framework. He says, the thing you do is you carefully look at all of the individual threats, all of the individual acts of violence. You check them out in isolation and you think, okay, what's the appropriate way to think about this? So you start with the individual cases, and then from those individual cases, you build them up into a theory about the ethics of war. And he thinks we should do this because cyber threats, cyber attacks, they're new, they're different, and we need to think about them from the ground up. He says that cyber attacks, so one point is the revisionist framework rather than the straight up just war framework is appropriate. And then another point he makes is that cyber attacks aren't always violent. But even though they aren't always violent, they can be violent. He talks about harm. He says sometimes they cause harm, sometimes they don't. And a case in which they cause harm is when he gives two examples. One of them is some hackers tried to poison the water supply in Florida. They hacked into the system, changed things that would cause the water supply to be poisoned and to harm people. And so that's a case where a cyber attack had the potential to cause physical harm. There was a ransomware attack at a German hospital, and after looking at the data, it contributed to a patient dying. Because of the ransomware, they didn't have access to what they needed to treat the patient died. And so cyber attacks can cause harm. Don't always, but they can cause harm. He also says that in order for cyber attacks to be violent, it's not just that they cause harm, but there's also two intentions that you've got to have, that the cyber attacker has to have. One is they've got to have the intention to harm. So they are trying to harm the person. Another is they've got to have the intention to dominate. And so what is it to dominate? Well, think about a long-distance sniper. He sees the victim off in the distance, pulls the trigger, shoots, the person dies. And so it's not just an act of harm, and it's not just an intention to harm, but it's an intention to dominate. The person can't respond, they're defenseless. And so that sort of thing, dominating the battle, the person can't respond, that's got to be involved, according to Finlay, in an act of violence. And so cyber attacks can involve both of these things. You can intend to technologically dominate. You create some vulnerability. You have secrecy. There's no way to respond. The subject is defenseless. The victim is defenseless. And then you can harm. You execute harm at will. And so in the background here, there's this theory of violence that he's got. something's an act of violence if and only if that act causes a physical harm. That's the first thing. It's done with the intention to harm. That's the other thing. And it's done with the intention to dominate. That's the third thing. So you got to have these two intentions, intention to harm and intention to dominate. You got to actually harm. All three of those things happen, then it's an act of violence, according to Finlay. He makes a third claim. He says that if cyber attacks are an act of violence, then defensive violence could be morally justified. So when that happens, when it's a cyber attack is an act of violence, and when you're justified in using defensive violence, then he says that's when you go back to the just war theory rules, and those should guide the counterattack. And so one of them is proportionality. If a cyber attack kind of a little bit hurts one person, then just dropping a bomb and nuking an entire civilization, that's a bit much. That's not going to be okay. Another lesson that he takes from this is he says, well, given that cyber attacks can be acts of violence, we got to be very careful when we engage in a cyber attack. So if us in the U.S., we engage in a cyber attack, if we don't do it right, it could count as an act of aggression and on a par with an act of physical violence, and that could start a war or make the enemy justified in fighting a war with us. So we've got to be cautious about how we do it.